For those of you who don't know me, I'm Diana Wu. I'm the Dean of UC Berkeley Extension, and my second hat is Executive Director of the Berkeley Resource Center for Online Education. It's my pleasure to introduce Colin Kaprosky. You've heard a little bit about from Colin, for those of you who were here for the Q&A a little bit earlier. And Laura, I think, gave a great overview for us to get a sense of the breadth and depth of the work that EAB does. And now Colin's going to talk specifically on a study. And Laura mentioned this very briefly, but the digital roadmap, the digital strategy roadmap, is actually a 2.5 hour long, 4-hour presentation that we asked Colin to not synthesize. We actually focused on some ideas that we thought would be of particular interest to those of us at Berkeley. So keep in mind that it's actually an even bigger, broader, more in-depth report than you're going to hear, but he's going to give you a real taste of the kind of work that they do on a topic that's extremely relevant to us all. So thanks for being here. And Colin, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Colin Kaprosky. I'm a research consultant in the academic affairs practice of the Education Advisory Board, and I don't need to do the spiel since Laura already did it. I've spent most of my time over the last 4 years or so looking at the impact of technology on higher education. So I started actually leading a much bigger report some of you may have seen called Engaging Faculty in Online Education. So that was focused on benchmarking incentive policies, course release policies, trying to get beyond early adopters and broaden the base of faculty willing and interested to teach online, and some benchmarking initiatives around there. I spent a year on the future of academic libraries. That was an area where technology was making a tremendous transformational impact on the traditional investments we make in the library space. I moved on to kind of take on Clayton Christensen's work on disruptive innovation in higher education. We found that every campus in the country had a Clayton Christensen book club going on among their trustees. So the provost and the president were having to answer all these questions about whether Google or Coursera or some other company was going to kind of sweep the rug out from under us and kind of have a huge disruptive impact on higher education. We're still waiting for that to happen. So I sort of moved on from that space to looking at some of the more prosaic operational challenges that folks face when they're making online a serious strategy on campus, beyond just some continuing education certificates, beyond an extension school, beyond a few isolated courses here and there. What does it mean to make online part of the core operation at a university? What does it mean to do this seriously in a financially sustainable and effective way? And so what I'll do today, again, is give you a taste or a preview of a much longer project that we're still working on. Again, moving from this phase of high-level insights about where the industry is going and how the provost or the president should think about online education, to very detailed implementation toolkits and roadmaps, templates, diagnostics, things to accelerate implementation on campus once we've grappled with those big ideas. And please interrupt me throughout with thoughts or questions or comments. I would ask that you raise your hand high so that we can get you a microphone so that folks can hear your question, but happy to take questions or comments throughout. So in the introductory section, I've broken it into 4 big basic buckets. The first one I'll address is the larger question of what do we mean when we are asking for an online strategy. I think you all already know that online is not one thing. It's a lot of things and can be aimed at a lot of different kinds of students in different ways, and we have to parse that apart and try to make the conversation on campus a little bit less vague and difficult and polemical, and try to make it more helpful and strategic going forward. Secondly, what I've called curing the cost disease. So the promise of tech-enabled or tech-enhanced instruction is that we can increase the scale, we can potentially decrease the cost of providing instruction, and potentially maintain quality while doing that, or improve quality. Again, that's easier said than done. It's very difficult to study that, but I want to unpack the factors that lead to increases or decreases in quality, access, and student success. Third, I'll walk through some of the early adopters, some of the big, large-scale initiatives online dating back to Fathom and All Learn around 2003 and 2004. What mistakes have people made when they've tried to throw a lot of money at this? Where did they kind of engage in missteps along the way, and what can we learn from those investments? And then finally, to segue into the real occasion for my research and my ongoing work, anticipating barriers to growth. So what we found is that when a lot of deans now and when a lot of provosts are suddenly so interested in online, largely because of the success or the increased interest in the MOOCs, they see this as a kind of instant money tree. They think they can sort of flip the online switch on many universities and get this international, global, or national brand that students will flow in, that revenue will flow in, it will be cheaper, and it will be easy and quick. That tends to never be the case. So what we've done is try to catalog all of the policy and procedure and implementation roadblocks and obstacles and challenges that you have to focus on before they end up on your desk and you end up having to solve them in a much more Band-Aid fashion than you might desire if you've proactively anticipated some of those challenges, whether it's IP rights, making sure that you've got sophisticated marketing and recruiting techniques, whether you anticipated challenges that accompany making changes to the academic calendar. There are dozens and dozens of issues that arise when you do online seriously. And so we've tried to catalog some of those, and I'll give you a preview of that. So this is to tee up why we made this transition into these big topics we covered this year in the Academic Affairs Forum. So what we realized is that when boards and stakeholders and alumni were asking questions about MOOCs, whether it's governors saying, can MOOCs be low-cost alternatives? I think we're familiar with that question in this state. Administrators worrying that we'll fall behind, we'll miss the train if we don't sign on to one of these partnerships. Boards very concerned that MOOCs will make us irrelevant. Faculty worried that MOOCs will make faculty expendable or sort of outsource instruction on many campuses. There were real strategic questions lurking beneath those vague prompts from those stakeholders. The first was sustainable tuition revenue. There's a concern about whether we've got an enrollment strategy that's going to be effective 10, 15, 20 years down the road if we know that high school graduates are going to look different, that we've got an aging population that has a need for continuing an education, that our strategy is going to have to respond to those changes. How can we think about demographic changes in a way that supports our strategy going ahead? And then secondly, what would an actual online strategy for a university look like? What would the components be, and how do we move from a vision to implementation? And that's where I've focused my time. So the view from the outside is kind of increasing tension and pressure. So first of all, headlines not just on the cover of the Chronicle of Higher Ed, but on the cover of the New York Times, right? David Brooks, Tom Friedman, talking about student debt, some negative news, some positive news about the promise that MOOCs might have, for example. Lots of pressure from the State House in California, Florida in particular, but lots of governors that are inviting competitors in, whether it's Straighter Line or Western Governors University, trying to get the systems to change a little bit more rapidly, and us having to respond to some of those calls for accelerated, more flexible offerings. Huge investments from venture capital and from the business community on some of these new online enablement firms, or huge amounts of venture capital investment in educational technology. So clearly lots of folks are throwing lots of money at ed tech as an issue and believe there's a future there. And so that's also causing pressure for us to respond to that and embrace some of those technologies. Reputational and peer pressure that always exists in higher education. Are we keeping up with what other folks are doing, regardless of whether that's actually bringing in new revenues for those folks? New competitors, I mentioned Western Governors University already. And then philanthropy. I mean, I know Bill Gates has, before Rick Perry, sort of floated the idea of a $2,000 degree. It ended up being a $10,000 degree in Texas. When somebody like Bill Gates is recorded saying, in the future, we'll just have adaptive robot faculty that will respond to students exactly at the pace that they're working, we then, again, have to grapple with the impact and the trickle-down effect of some of those comments that are made from people who can, frankly, afford to throw millions and millions of dollars at alternative technologies and providers. The other thing I think that's different now is we can't just associate online and web-mediated instruction with the University of Phoenix anymore, right? there are universities of all shapes and sizes that have moved and gotten to massive scale online. So everything from a community college, Rio Salado, they have start date every week, dozens and dozens of thousands of online students. Even some small, religious, mission-oriented liberal arts colleges, like an Indiana Wesleyan or a St. Leo's in Florida, they might have 1,000 or 2,000 undergraduates living residentially on campus. But the pipeline of those students who are wealthy enough to pay for that experience and who will go to those universities is kind of shrinking and shrinking every year. So they've been able to subsidize that residential mission with, in many cases, thousands and thousands of online students across the world, military students, adult degree completers, and certificates, bachelor degree completion programs, and master's programs. Regional public universities tended to move the fastest in this area. So schools like Arizona State or the University of Central Florida, those are two of the largest universities in the country, and part of that scale comes from their quick embrace of hybrid, multimodal education. I've got a slide on UCF in a little bit. So by offering their curriculum, especially general education, as many formats as possible, hybrid, fully online, face-to-face, asynchronous, synchronous sort of modularity, they can get to a huge scale and really help address their student success and retention and throughput graduation concerns in making sure that students are not waitlisted, but they're getting into courses and maintaining a full course load. And then finally, at elite research universities, USC has been interesting in that they're doing almost nothing for undergraduates. They have not joined the MOOC bandwagon, but they're going to bring in $110 million this year just from online graduate and professional programs. So they've doubled down on that space, primarily in engineering and education, but that's been a tremendous source of scale and reputation and revenue for them. So one of the things we noticed was that online had sort of moved from the footnotes of many strategic plans of the universities we looked at to the front page. So the number of presidents and provosts that say online is critical to my long-term strategy has just skyrocketed over the last decade or so. Lots of new appointees to the president's cabinet tasked at looking at a central online strategy. Folks like Sanjay Sarma at MIT or Paul Berman at GW, there's a lot of folks don't really know what they're doing. They were kind of faculty that were elevated to these roles in light of signing on to a Coursera and edX. So they kind of play a PR role more than anything. Other folks like Deb Gearhart at Ohio that are tasked more with bringing order from chaos, a lot of arbitrary online courses, trying to create portfolios, genuinely creating competitive online programs. But this is clearly an issue that has been elevated to a much higher level discussion. And we've collected dozens and dozens of task forces that are being compiled and put together very rapidly on campuses. And it's been instructive for us to try to pull apart what's in these task forces and to what extent they're actually helpful for the provost that's hoping to make change here. We were actually alarmed at some of the things we found in these task forces. So I pulled some actual quotes from some universities where the faculty senate would take on the issue of online education and say that we've decided proactively that we're not going to discuss financial issues because we don't think they're relevant. That any parts of the new model that we're exploring or any new degrees or any new certificate programs we decide to launch, all of the processes, governance, teaching, instruction, support must be identical to those we have face-to-face. And then finally, the financial case for investment online is dubious. Any policies that are birthed forward from this process must be based only on quality of teaching and learning alone. So I think compounded with the fact that they often ask somewhat ephemeral, impossible to answer questions, like is online as good as face-to-face? There have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies. I don't think there are any empirical studies that would suddenly change everybody's mind on this. It's a very sort of politicized debate. And frankly, quality in online courses, which I'll address in a second, depends on a lot more than the modality of the course delivery. So combined with the refusal to answer some of these financial issues can result in a lot of difficult problems for the administration, right? They could squander their political capital at a moment they really thought they could make a big bet online and end up not having much of a movement. This happened at Duke University, where the provost, Peter Lang, I believe he's retiring, but this was going to be a big new initiative joining a company called 2U, which was formerly called Tutor, with an initiative called Semester Online. And all Semester Online is a consortium only of 6 to 10 hyper-elite institutions putting 1 or 2 courses online and offering some seats in those courses to students at other elite institutions. So very kind of small, dipping your toe in, not very expensive. We're talking about a few courses. But by the time that initiative and that contract got down to, I believe, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, it got nixed. We felt like this was too much change too soon, clearly driven by revenue goals. We don't know what this means for Duke. So at a critical moment, there was a backlash, and we're seeing this often with the MOOCs now. Amherst University saying, we don't want to join edX. We don't think this is appropriate for our mission. The Provost at American issuing a MOOC moratorium. We're sort of seeing that not joining a MOOC is the new joining a MOOC in terms of the reputational impact or the gains you might make. The other danger is that you actually decide to do a lot of stuff online, but you haven't considered any of the costs or revenues because you've decided not to, or because the folks who are deciding have not taken on those issues. So either you decide to do nothing, or you launch new degrees and new programs and new initiatives that you're not going to be able to sustain over time. So I think the key first step with regard to reframing the debate is to move from whether we're going to do this or whether this is going to happen to us to acknowledging that we are all going to do and use technology in some ways for almost all of our students. And the real question we have to ask ourselves is how and for what ends. So, the first semantic mistake people tend to get bogged down in is that online is not a market. We didn't sort of pull out the online market in our enrollment strategy work. There are lots of different populations that you could use online for in different ways. And it's important to understand your enrollment goals and your curricular goals first before you think about how technology might help you serve those goals. Secondly, online is not automatically better or automatically always worse. There are lots of other factors that contribute to not only success and quality within a course, but the retention of a student and their on-time graduation and their career outcomes. That depends on dozens and dozens of factors. And frankly, wraparound student support services and access to coaching and tutoring tends to matter a lot more than sometimes the content in the course. Thirdly, there are hundreds of people that say online is always more expensive to do. There are an equal number of people that say online is always cheaper to deliver. They're both right, and they're both wrong at the same time. Again, that depends on lots of other factors that don't have to do with the modality. There are, of course, some fixed costs, some sunk costs when you build online infrastructure at first, but then the ongoing cost per student is going to be driven by the same economics that we already had face-to-face. How expensive is the faculty teaching the course? How many of them are there? How big are the sections, and how many sections do we have? So for the same reason that large lecture courses for undergraduates taught by a TA are very inexpensive, an online course with the same format has those same economics. But it won't be cheaper if you have 12 students with a full-time tenured professor. So you end up in the same kind of quality debates, really, when you start talking about cost that are inescapable. The fourth semantic mistake is assuming that online is about replacing your campus or that it's a sort of zero-sum game. Online is not going to replace anybody's campus, but it will augment, again, the opportunities available to students that we already have or to students who don't have access yet, who might want hybrid or online opportunities. But I think approaching it in this kind of Manichaean fashion about it's either all or nothing is really problematic and just frankly not grounded in reality. And finally, online is not a strategy. It's not a strategy to do online. Online is a tool or a tactic you would use for a real strategy. It could be enrollment strategy, revenue strategy, curricular strategy, a new program that you want to launch within the law school, for example. And so it's important to try to put those strategies first before we think about moving online in a big way. So I want to move on to the prospect of breaking the so-called iron triangle in higher education. And Bill Bowen has kind of been an interesting figure around this debate. So he's a labor economist, was the president of Princeton, a very widely known kind of voice in higher education. And he spent a long time, many decades, decrying folks who said that technology would be transformational in higher education and increase productivity. He wrote a famous book where he argued that in some sectors, productivity just cannot be increased. There's cost disease. So the performing arts were a classic example of this. A string quartet cannot be made more cost effective or produce more per unit of input. It just always takes 9 minutes to play a song, and these 4 expensive, highly trained musicians. But because of inflation and benefits, you have to pay those musicians more and more and more every year to produce the same product. And we say the same thing about education, right? Quality education requires an expert, credentialed faculty member in a small face-to-face classroom with attentive students. And to any extent that you start to compromise on that, you are losing or you are degrading the quality of that education. But he is going around giving talks now saying he's changed his mind about this. He's changed his mind about the prospect of at least maintaining the same level of quality with lower cost through using online learning in certain ways, in certain manifestations. He studied in particular Candace Thiel's work. She's now at Stanford, was at Carnegie Mellon, through the Open Learning Initiative, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So if Bill is right, then this is a tremendous, momentous occasion, and we should try to unpack how you might break any side of that triangle. I want to begin with the prospect of access, and I think one of the big players to watch in the access debate are governors and state systems, which are obviously every state has their own pithily titled Drive to 2025 completion goal. That's largely unrealistic, but President Obama has made this a primary directive, and states are trying to dramatically increase the percentage of folks in that state that have some kind of higher education credential. So access is a big motivation for online within state systems. Florida was an interesting story. So there was the head of the House in Florida, Will Weatherford, the Speaker of the House, decided that Florida needed a virtual university. I'm not sure why, but he did, and it ended up being a tremendously powerful charge. So Florida already had a number of universities that were very advanced online and had done so of their own volition through their mission. But he decided that in addition to what they had, which was a kind of shared online catalog of online courses, they needed a separate big online degree platform for the state. So they commissioned a report from the Parthenon Group to look at actually 5 options. The 5th one, not included in here, is a for-profit competitor to bring in, like Western governors that would do this for them. So they considered these options about how to go about doing this. And I think we'll see this in more and more states as they consider online more centralized. One option would be decentralized development, and this is what Florida already had. Minnesota has this, where it's largely just kind of a central repository and online catalog of what people offer, but they might have 1 or 2 staff members. Really, there's no way to change any of the behavior of the constituent universities. It allows everybody to basically proceed as they did before. Another option would be to create a new online entity. So this only exists in 2 states that I know of, Maryland with UMUC, which is a completely online separate university, and Colorado with Colorado State Global Campus. And that allows, again, the existing constituent universities to basically proceed as they did before. It doesn't, ruffle any feathers, but then you can innovate in a separate campus. Another option, and we've seen this in a number of states, is system-wide collaboration. And this creates some political tension. When there's a central office within a state system that's trying to coordinate, trying to herd the cats, trying to get some shared, getting students enrolled across campuses, get some shared degree programs. This tends to be very difficult to execute. I interviewed the new director of online for the Indiana University system, which has a number of campuses and created a central online office. And like any good new administrator, her first task was to do a listening tour. So she went around to each campus and did interviews with the provosts and the deans, and she asked them all, what would you like or what would you need from me? What do you need from a central office of online learning? And they said 2 things: leave me alone and protect me from everybody else. Right? So I think from the system's point of view, there seem to be these easily attainable economies of scale. Right? Why do all of our campuses have an online MBA? Can't we just have one? Can't we just share courses? Do we need an online version of Econ 101 at every campus? From a business perspective, or from a system perspective, it looks like you could deduplicate, get some rational changes there, but it tends to be very difficult in execution. And frankly, most of the consortial agreements that I've seen within systems, 90% of the online students are enrolled at their campus or at their campus's online courses. So it's very difficult to get at some of those economies of scale. So to get to the issue of what flagships, particularly the R1, more prestigious flagships, are facing, what they ended up deciding was to take the R1, the University of Florida, which has as its mission now to rise in the rankings. I mean, they really want to be a top 10 flagship public research university. But they were designated as the lead institution in this online initiative. And they were tasked with offering fully online undergraduate degrees to first-time, full-time freshmen, 18 to 24-year-olds. And they cannot cost more than 75% of their in-state tuition. In-state tuition at the University of Florida is $6,000. So that's, I think, less than half of what Berkeley is. So they are already extremely cheap for what you get at the University of Florida. And now they're tasked with creating these online degrees. We've tried to help them find a market for this, to find other examples of fully online undergraduate degrees aimed at 17, 18-year-old high school graduates, again, who get into the University of Florida, right, who have 4.0 GPAs, who scored a 30 on the ACT. It just doesn't exist. So this is an example of, I think, a state thinking that they can either create a market or that there is this unmet huge amount of demand for fully online programs. They're trying to turn this into more of a 2+2 agreement with community colleges, aim at more at adult degree completers. But again, the University of Central Florida and other schools within the system already kind of claim that space. So it's an interesting development to watch in terms of what the prestigious flagships are being asked to do and what fits more with their mission, which might be doctoral education, graduate and professional education, maybe an extension school. I wanted to show, yeah, please.
University of Florida, was it the governor's office who kind of mandated the flagship to? There's a microphone. Thank you. Colin, the University of Florida example, was it the governor's office who kind of mandated the flagship to roll out undergraduate online degrees?
The idea germinated from Will Weatherford, who was the Speaker of the House, but Rick Scott was a huge fan of it. So the system in Florida of the universities is very tightly interwoven with the legislature and with the governor. Rick Scott has a lot of power. So this was all part of I think the renewal of a higher education bill that was passed. And it was also tied, this is a little gossipy, but it was also tied to the designation of Florida as the preeminent research university in the state, which gets them access to additional funds. 50% of the revenues from those degrees will go to research. So that's kind of the inside scoop or the background of why it might have been in Florida's interest a little bit to become the lead institution. So it was a little bit of a tit for tat with the governor who wanted, I guess, more access for a group that I don't think exists but potentially could. I think another option for them is to look at out-of-state students, which obviously would be able to pay much higher fees for those programs if they could attract them from the neighboring states. But yeah, it was primarily driven by the legislature and by the governor. So I think this graph from the University of Central Florida makes a very important point, which is the rise of the multimodal student. So the fallacy that Tom Cavanaugh, who's sort of their director of online, points out is that we tend to think of students as being place-bound or kind of an online student, a hybrid student, a face-to-face residential student, and we're alarmed when those things tend to mix and match. But what we're seeing, and this is starting first in more access-focused schools, but becoming the case more and more at schools like Berkeley, where students can, within one semester, take courses of different modalities according to what their schedule is or whatever might fit their process better. So what they found was that these sort of bubbles are moving closer and closer together and overlapping more and more to where within the same semester they've got thousands and thousands of students that are mixing and matching. They're all tend to be in the greater Orlando area, so they might have one class on campus, one class at a regional campus, one that's blended, and another that's fully online. And as we see the rise of the non-traditional student and the increasing non-traditionalization of traditional students, meaning that they're older or that they're working or that they have kids, they have more of those characteristics, they're a little bit harder to serve in a 4-year traditional residential format. Or as it gets more expensive to build new buildings, new classroom buildings, dorm space, parking structures, along with some of our enrollment growth goals or perhaps enrollment growth mandates, online and hybrid becomes a very attractive option. So they've been seeing students of their own volition start to mix and match more and more, and they see this as a big part of fulfilling their access mission. This is how they get to 60,000 undergrads, by making as much of their curriculum as possible available in a variety of formats. Yeah? I guess we have to get the...
I'm wondering about whether, first of all, were those full-time students that we're looking at all fully enrolled, rather than students who are enrolled half-time and that kind of thing?
I think this would be combined.
Combined, right?
So this is looking at just any given term.
Right. The other question that I had is, has anybody, or have you done any research around the cost of tuition? You were mentioning what's driving people, students to maybe go part-time. Some of the things that the legislatures are actually worried about, like it's taking time to degree and all of that stuff, in terms of the rising cost in tuition and more students choosing to become that kind of student because they have to work. Right. Or because they have to do other things in their lives, not just the student that's coming back.
Right. So to clarify the question, what's the question about the price?
I guess have you done any research around the cost of tuition going up and the type of student that's actually beginning to attend college? Okay. Does that make sense? And then whether or not they may be being driven to this because of that reason.
I think there is a relation in that students are becoming more price sensitive because families are under more and more pressure. Even the wealthiest families, which we really depend on to subsidize less wealthy students who we're giving aid to, have cut down the most. Actually, this is one thing we found in the enrollment strategy research. Cut back the most in terms of the amount that they will spend on higher education. So what universities and colleges are doing, even the liberal arts colleges in turn to that, to answer for that, is marketing and trying to deliver on guarantees about time to degree and total price. So even to lock in a price, if they know they're going to raise their tuition probably every year, guaranteeing that the tuition they enter at will stay the same. And I think online, typically this is done most in terms of friendlier articulation policies. So Notre Dame de Namur, which is not too far from here in Belmont, California, basically changed their whole proposition, marketing value proposition, to be all around getting you out in time. So we're twice as expensive as a CSU or as a Berkeley might be, but you'll graduate, there won't be any wait lists here, you'll have access to the courses you need, they'll be smaller, and you'll have less debt at the end because we'll get you out on time. And so to the extent that the proposition of multimodal learning is about throughput, I think that can be tremendously valuable to get students through, making sure they have access to things in the summer, or if they have to leave for a fall semester for whatever reason, that they can stay on track. But I think there's another issue here about both the cost to deliver this, because you save some money because you are using less classroom space, right? But do you charge more for online courses? Do you charge less? And what happens with cannibalization if you do that? There's no kind of one answer to that. A lot of folks are worried about doing either of those, but at UCF, their policy is that, there are no faculty incentives to teach online, develop online courses, and everything is priced exactly the same. And they can do that because they've been doing this for 15 or 20 years, where this is just part of what it means to be a student or a faculty member at UCF. Other schools have to be much more strategic and entrepreneurial about how they carefully calibrate the prices and costs and incentives they're instituting, especially if they want to be able to change them later and not make them part of the faculty handbook or part of a standard tuition policy. And in the case of a public, when all the pricing has to go through a central board or through the legislature. So I like to show UCF, but typically the reaction is, well, I don't want to have 60,000 students who are marginally qualified. But what I found is that even at the most liberal artsy institutions and at the most elite institutions, there are lots of great applications of technology and online hybrid in the curriculum. So I've charted out a straw man of how even a Yale or a Harvard or a liberal arts institution might use online to help their students. So you might have an online remedial ramp-up course for students who aren't quite ready to jump into calculus and they want to be a pre-med major, or for students who didn't score high enough on their math course, want to be a business major. Can we have them take an accelerated readiness course or a remedial course before they arrive on campus in the fall? A lot of us are flipping the classroom in general education because these are already very large courses. They're difficult to teach. They have high drop, fail, withdrawal rates. This is happening very rapidly in the sciences. Studio physics has been doing this for a very long time. There are lots of interesting pedagogical and just cost scale enrollment benefits from hybrid learning formats in gen ed. Some interesting ideas I found around self-paced catch-up courses. So this is if a student is in the course of a 15-week regular term in a face-to-face course, and for whatever reason has to drop or withdraw within those first couple of weeks, they can opt into an accelerated online version of that course. Now that's helpful because the institution doesn't have to find additional classroom space for those fail-safe courses or those opt-in courses, but it also keeps those students who may have then dropped below financial aid eligibility, they may have lost their full-time status, they may have to wait another year before getting access to Econ 101. This keeps those students on track. Study abroad. So we want students to be doing more experiential learning, to have more opportunities to work, to have more opportunities to travel. But again, that's very difficult to do if you're a double major, if you've got a minor, if you're trying to get out in 4 years and not take 5 or 6. So online is another opportunity there. To try to serve undergraduates who are engaging in some of those opportunities and might not be able to make it to all of the class meetings on campus. And then finally, summer tends to be the easiest or the low-hanging fruit to experiment with online courses because it's an opportunity for faculty to get kind of out of the box of what they expect in the fall and spring terms. Students tend to be away from campus, so that's an area where we can easily invest, and also an area for students who are interested more in flexible offerings to get access to some of those courses. And again, we found even Yale in a task force report that they wrote said, okay, subject to the approval of your Department of Undergraduate Studies and your undergraduate dean, we will let you take one, but not more than one online course per term. So the kind of perceptual wall against trying this at all with undergraduates, Duke's example notwithstanding, is beginning to lower. I wanted to say a little bit about MOOCs, although obviously the topic has been maybe not beaten to death, but very close, near death. At this point. And I want to bring it up because I think people talk a lot about MOOCs with respect to scale, or what's possible using technology to scale learning with a certain amount of expectation about outcomes. And I charted out this, what I think is the typical enrollment pattern in most MOOCs. So the numbers that we see, when we see that Coursera has millions of students, edX has millions of students, that means that you gave them your email at some point in time, right? Those are considered students. I don't think Berkeley would consider those enrolled students. You need to actually show that you're getting them through the curriculum. So what typically happens is you might have 100,000 students sign up for a course. 40,000 of those might do anything other than sign up, meaning that they click on the website another time, or they go and watch the beginning of the first video. The minute you make them do something, right? So you've got to take a quiz, you've got to do a group project, you've got to list out 5 things you learned, you lose almost everyone. You might end up with 10,000 or 8,000, the original 100,000. So you end up with this kind of long tail of self-motivated completers. And the next slide will give you an idea of who those tend to be. But there's some real numbers here from Duke. This is a 2% completion rate, right? So about 13,000 registered, but only 313 got a certificate. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with this. I think it's access to something in the same way that my family had a collection of encyclopedias and I had access to those encyclopedias or to textbooks. It's free information. Free information is great. But it's not the same thing as access to higher education with the complexity of all of what we mean there. So before I get to your question, I love this quote, which is from an ed tech specialist at Northeastern. These are mostly taken by ed tech specialists, people with advanced degrees, and Tom Friedman, and higher ed researchers, at least. So again, I think that MOOCs are a great thing, but I think they are a more complicated, more advanced version of what a textbook was. I think we can use them to expand availability to content, but it's proving to be very challenging to use them for the same things that we hope to get out of higher education as a whole, which is the creation of an educated citizen of democracy, somebody who has a major that is compelling in an interview with an employer, somebody who's gone through a rite of passage experience that's going to prepare them for adulthood, I think it's a bit of a jump or a bit of a logical leap from one to the other, although we have seen MOOCs get incrementally better. Did you have a comment?
More of a comment. I mean,
Yeah.
To a large extent, you're treating all these things as if they're fungible, and I really think that there's big differences among MOOCs, there's big differences among online courses, et cetera. We actually had a pretty successful statistics MOOC that had a 16% certificate rate. I mean, it matters who's teaching, it matters how much effort you put in the materials, all this stuff matters. I'm not saying that they had the same experience somebody in a Berkeley classroom would have, they didn't, right? But similarly, you're saying that it's less expensive to have an online class because you save the physical space. Well, I'm actually not sure that that's true. The fixed cost of developing really rich, really effective online materials is astronomical.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more.
And then also because the sort of the bandwidth in the literal sense of how much information you can exchange between a student and a graduate student instructor or faculty member is so much lower online than it is face to face. I've found that you have to staff up the number of graduate student instructors when you move a class online, and so that the scaling is actually not the same, and it's not clear to me at all that you end up saving money.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect segue to this slide, in that what I found is that I couldn't agree with you more about both of your points, that obviously MOOCs are not all created equal in the same way that online and hybrid course is not one thing. But in fact, I think what you pointed out was that the modality is only one part of that. So what I found that tremendously interesting about where MOOCs are going is what I've called the indelible middleman. And so this is my argument that the cost disease is pretty persistent in education. So the first folks that were doing MOOCs really well, out of their own volition because they were passionate. So Al Philwright's great poetry professor at Penn posted over 4,300 times during one MOOC that he taught. I think he averaged over 80 or 90 posts a day. Again, he's working 80 hours a week teaching this course. Yeah, another faculty member at Georgia Tech saying, look, this absolutely buried me. The amount of work that it took to do this well was incredible, and frankly, I'm not sure I want to do it again. So then we started seeing all these other things popping up. So a Harvard professor sending a massive email spam out to all of his alumni saying, can anybody help me volunteer to help TA this course? New startups popping up alongside edX, Coursera, Udacity, kind of face-to-face tutoring and coaching services. Again, Udacity is now, through their partnerships with San Jose State and others, hiring more and more paraprofessional TAs and coaches, tutors and mentors to try to get these students, again, from a 2% completion rate to a 10%, to a 20%, to a 30%. So I loved this quote from Sebastian Thrun because I think it says everything that needs to be said about MOOCs. He says, what I've learned is that a computer program alone is not likely to be a good educational medium to large numbers of people, except for the truly highly self-motivated. To be successful, we need, quote, people on the ground to do things, which is why we have universities, right? So I think, again, MOOCs in and of themselves can be great, but it turns out to do them well, to get from 2% to the 13% or the 16%, either requires that Herculean effort by the greatest faculty ever, or frankly just lots of staff and attention and amount of effort that I don't think Jerry Brown or Rick Scott or Thrun initially or Bill Gates anticipated. So the name of the article that this quote is from was called the MOOC Magic Formula Emerging, and I hoped that they were going to show me some adaptive learning algorithm, right? That through sophisticated programming replicated some of those cost-as-easy structures. But it turned out that the magic formula was, quote, people on the ground to do things, which again, I think is part of the limitation here, not just of MOOCs, but in terms of low-cost, scalable online learning. I think it is pretty expensive, in some cases prohibitively expensive, to do this at a high level of engagement and to do it well. And so that's part of I think the occasion for the study that I'm doing is to convince people that, again, this isn't a switch you turn. And frankly, teaching well online is a tremendously new activity. It tends to be very difficult, it requires a lot of training, new acclimation. You can be very good in front of a group, but not very good in front of a screen or in terms of responding to posts very quickly on a forum. Yeah?
Make one more comment, just like speak to that.
Yeah.
I've been teaching an online somebody else taught it for the first time in this last summer, using my recorded online lectures, my materials, my homework problems, my everything, my exams. The failure rate was almost double.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah. So another great version of that. So there's, I know there was some interest among the Berkeley community in adaptive learning and learning analytics. And we get a lot of questions about this. So the foremost company right now in adaptive learning is called Newton. So Newton came out of the test prep area. They've got tons of venture capital. They're on the cover of Time magazine. They've had a number of partnerships, primarily around remedial math, because remedial math is the biggest problem right now in higher education, in the fat part of the bell curve of students who need access. So they did a pilot with over 5,000 students at Arizona State. The first semester of the pilot was with just a few faculty members. And what this was a Math Emporium style redesign. So you have a large classroom, students sit at a computer and work through some exercises. You're probably familiar with this with statistics, because this is one course that you can flip this way, is you're working through a pretty well-designed software program. They invested a lot of money in that software program, and it's self-paced, meaning that you are going through exactly it's meeting you exactly where you are throughout the curriculum. You're not listening to a lecture. The role of the faculty and the TAs is to kind of roam around, help folks where they have problems. And there's a dashboard to highlight where students are getting stuck. So the first semester of the pilot, there was a pretty demonstrable gain in the pass rate, a lowering of the DFW rate. Year 2 happens. They had some sections with 30% pass rates, some with 90. There was just absolutely no statistical significance. It was all over the map, same multi-million-dollar adaptive learning platform. So again, I think that speaks to your point perfectly, in that the technology is a piece of this. It can enable scale, it can enable self-paced learning, but it doesn't replace all of the pieces. It turns out that the enthusiasm of the faculty member, the different teaching styles, the extent to which students get the feeling that you care about them, that they're not just a number in the class, tends to matter a lot for students who don't already have PhDs, right? So that's part of the difficulty here. So another big trend we're seeing is less folks talking about the fully online future and more folks acknowledging that things are going to get more and more blended. Actually, hybrid is the new online, I think. And part of this comes from some research that really opens a lot of eyes and drops some jaws to the floor about who fully online students are. It turns out that students enrolled in fully online programs, 80% of them tend to be local students. They live within driving distance of a university. So for the vast majority of institutions in higher education, even their fully online programs that don't even require you to come take a proctored exam on campus, those are all local students. If you look at the percentage of students that tend to study out of state, it hovers around 23%. So if you think about that, your campus is more national in terms of where you're drawing students from than your online programs, it's a bit of an oxymoron, but I think people have to grapple with this. So nobody agrees whether this is a permanent feature of the market, whether people are just kind of super brand aware right now and not sure about other kind of schools from other states. But this is the case of enrollment now. It's going to be less the case for a very elite institution like Berkeley, which I think has a greater chance for a national market or an international market. But by and large, this tends to be the case. Hybrid instruction tends to be just better. It gets better results when people meet at the beginning of the class, meet at the end of the class, have some face-to-face interaction. They like the familiarity with your brand. They think that that local brand will matter when they're looking for jobs with local employers. So it tends to make a big difference. So I think more folks are going to be designing programs with that in mind, understanding that students like the idea that they could potentially come to campus so that they are part of a campus community, not enrolling at Southern New Hampshire University across the entire country. I mean, so the good news here is that it means that Southern New Hampshire University is not going to take all of your students, right? Western Governors, there won't be some giant national Costco of online education that's going to drive everybody out of business. The bad news is that a lot of the provosts I talk to say, finally, I can do online and I will break down all of the geographical barriers that I've been stuck with, right? I'm in Ohio. There aren't that many high school graduates down the pipeline in Ohio. So once I flip the online switch, I can get students from everywhere. You're not going to get students from everywhere. Your brand only carries so far, and students like, again, that familiar local brand. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword in that we'll all remain relevant, but we're not going to gain hundreds of thousands of students from across the country. I want to say just a few things about cost. It's come up already, and I implied already that it's kind of the same old cost drivers that tend to determine how much you're paying, at least per student within a course. So Carol Twigg at NCAT has probably done the most rigorous analysis of the cost to educate students in a hybrid format, particularly for access-focused schools over the last 13 years or so. And she published a big paper saying, she found very divergent, very different percentages of cost savings per student within the same subjects with the same kinds of redesigns. And she asked what drove that difference between the cost savings. It wasn't the discipline, that certain disciplines were just easier to save money in than others. It wasn't that liberal arts institutions can save more money than public. It wasn't the original cost of the course. It wasn't that faculty at Virginia Tech just have higher salaries. What really drove the cost savings, it's pretty basic. It was the staff decisions and the size of the sections, which tend to be decisions by department chairs and faculty about what quality means, how big they think they can make sections. So just to pull out one example, Frostburg State achieved 66% savings in a psychology course. Missouri State saved only 9%. Why? Well, because Frostburg State tripled their section size, whereas Missouri State only doubled it. So the sections became 1/3 of original at Frostburg, only half at Missouri State. Missouri State reinvested those savings in graduate students, in TAs, in things that probably made that class a little bit better, a little bit more rich for students, whereas Frostburg just kind of captured the cost savings. And so this isn't groundbreaking stuff, but the idea is it all comes back to decisions about how big you're willing to make sections and how you're staffing the course. And so there's more and more interest among a lot of provosts in the master course model or in unbundling the instructional model in a way that perhaps a tenured professor, research professor designs the course or designs the outcomes, but then it's sort of franchised out among adjuncts or part-timers, or we use student instructors to lead supplemental tutorials. That can drive cost savings, but I think it's instructive to pull apart what drives that and the fact that it's just not automatic. It depends on those difficult decisions, which frankly are sort of difficult to broach. I think to the extent that you're defining quality as outcomes, one thing that I've noticed by looking at all of the empirical studies of course redesigns is that they all tend to look like the high-tech, high-touch model I've outlined on the right here. So UPACE is an interesting adaptive model pioneered in the Milwaukee system, UW-Milwaukee, that combines analytics from the LMS, in their case Blackboard, with automated prompts from faculty that send responses to things that students did. Either they performed poorly on a quiz, or they turned in a quiz late, or they did really well on a quiz. That feedback, really active feedback from the instructor, ended up making a big difference in outcomes, and it was made possible, again, by the fact that all of those things were being logged online, and you could scale the emails. Particularly for underprepared students, that's been pretty successful for them. OLI was pioneered at Carnegie Mellon. Again, Candace Teal, who is the founder of OLI, since moved to Stanford. This is an adaptive learning platform pioneered in statistics, but now in 12 or 13 different disciplines that can be taught hybrid, can be taught fully online. But they've got teams of cognitive scientists that study learning for a living that have designed these courses. They've had a lot of trouble getting faculty across higher ed to adopt these because telling somebody, here, teach this course tends to not work very well. But the success rates have been impressive, and students tend to get through it even faster. And then finally, lots of remedial math designs led by Carol Twigg at NCAT that get students through faster at lower cost with higher success rates. But they tend to all look like this. They involve some kind of interactive software, right? So you're not just watching a 60-minute lecture. You're not just reading online and then taking a test. There's some kind of interaction with the material, and it's active online. Often there's, again, the cost disease of on-demand assistance from people that can help you get through, people that hold you accountable, people that are watching your activity in the course so that it doesn't just feel like you are a number. And then finally, structured progress incentives. This is often what people are referring to when they talk about gamification. So acquiring experience points or stars or some kind of badge system that gets people a sense of recognition and progress throughout the course. It lowers the stakes that you might have in a course that just has a midterm and a final, and encourages that kind of gradual mastery over time. So I think there is a somewhat right answer to quality if you want better outcomes, particularly in general education courses online. Obviously, it gets complicated when you're teaching upper division music courses. You can't do the same model for every kind of course. But I think we have made a lot of progress if we have the ability to design these courses from scratch or use some of these models already. There are some practices that tend to be pretty consistent across the successful course redesigns. The problem is that nobody agrees on what quality means or what the definition of quality is in higher education. So in a traditional university, I think interaction and faculty expertise are where it's at. I think that's how we define our value proposition, and that what we deliver is our foremost faculty of active research agendas and close contact with those faculty that can't be scaled successfully online. I think outcomes and learning assessment are where the ed tech folks and the course redesign folks tend to focus. Excelsior colleges tends to focus almost exclusively on rigorous psychometric analysis of prior learning and abilities and competencies. And competency is a very sexy buzzword right now in higher education, particularly among people who pay for it, because it seems like that you could just get rid of the credit hour, get rid of seat time. People can just prove what they already know and get through very quickly and very cheaply. Standardization. So that's the sort of McDonald's argument that we've set a minimum bar that nobody can go below because we have designed and franchised and automated this course across the curriculum. Professional design. So there are companies like Rosetta Stone, other providers that can spend $1 million per course and design a really amazing video game-like experience that tends to raise the bar. So maybe that's what we mean by quality. So I think part of the difficulty here, whether you're talking about how big we can make the course, how much we can achieve access gains, how much it's going to cost, and what the outcomes are going to be, would be going back to some of these really difficult debates about can we agree on what quality means for this course, for this program, for this degree, for this university, and how do we inflect that with regard to the standards we enforce in online courses. And that's been true far before we had online, right? When we decide who teaches our face-to-face courses and how big they are and how we teach them. So I think there's no way of just avoiding that or making it easy. Another big question is online for whom, and differentiating the different markets we might want to go after. So there's the residential undergraduate market for whom I think on-time graduation and the allowance of exploration through some of those online courses or summer study abroad courses can be very helpful. Masters and professional students who don't have time to come and move and live on campus for 2 years. They have different kind of consumer behaviors, shopping behaviors. They want different things in courses. They want something that's going to be relevant and translational to a promotion or to a career change. And then adult degree completers. This is the largest untapped market in higher education. There are about 2 million of them now, but potentially about 50 or 60 million of them across the country, because we are generating, as a system, 400,000 per year who drop out. Very low success rates at many public institutions in this country, so we're churning out more and more of these potential adult degree completers every year who have some credits but didn't finish an associate's or a bachelor's degree. So a lot of folks are looking there, and this will probably be where Florida goes with those bachelor's degree programs, and where a lot of extension schools are focused already, is attracting those students, getting them to come back. I think for R1s and for AAU elite universities, you see a kind of four-pronged approach. One is to offer MOOCs and kind of explore where that's going to lead in terms of the forefront of the technology. Many elite schools have an extension tradition. So Harvard's been doing this for many decades. UC obviously has an extension tradition, but that kind of lives outside of the core campus operation. The biggest movement, I think, or the third prong of an elite strategy tends to be online or hybrid master's and professionals programs. I know you have one in public health now, looking at launching 2 more. 3 now, okay. So this has been, obviously I gave the example of USC earlier, but Hopkins, a number of other schools are bringing lots of revenue and creating a lot of enrollment and reputation in the market through scaling those professional programs online. And then the final prong is dipping our toes in the water in terms of the undergraduate space. Now that can be like that, the sort of arrow I showed on the Yale slide of offering a course here and there, allowing more opportunities over the summer, signing up with semester online with a company like 2U. But there's been very little movement in that space, and I think that will be slow because of the kinds of students we're attracting and because we already tend to have very high retention and success rates. But I think there's demonstrable evidence that, at least at UW Milwaukee, they did a study that correlated taking at least one online class per semester with time to degree. So there are achievable gains, I think, no matter how elite you are, from offering the option of online or blended courses. And frankly, it can be better pedagogy, especially in some of those introductory science courses when you've flipped the classroom and you're using technology more. So one of the difficulties with a lot of our research projects, because they are syndicated across the membership, but I think exemplified very well in this project, is that everybody has different goals for online. So we can't just do one online study. And I think it's interesting and instructive for our task forces and for our leadership to try to place ourselves on a map like this. So at the top, you're thinking of what proportion of our offerings or our student credit hours generated would be online. And to what extent do we want to move rightward on this map and tailor our offerings to do that? So whether it's residential undergraduate, graduate professional, adult degree completion, people are in very different spots on this map. They might be very far in the graduate professional space, like USC, but don't even have limited summer courses online. So I think part of the task force process, or the strategic planning process, is deciding where you want to be on this and how far you want to move to the right. The next step then would be anticipating what investments it actually takes to move to the right. And that's what we focus most of our research on. But I also want to touch on this organizational question, because this is an area where the provost actually has some power, and it's a very momentous decision. It's also a very difficult decision because there are pros and cons to every way of organizing an online effort on a campus. So what I've done here is kind of given us one way to visualize the differences between the major org models on a spectrum of autonomy from the core and degree granting authority, right? The ability to grant your own degrees and not just do non-credit offerings or certificates. So if you're a non-degree granting shared service unit, it's kind of a central core support unit for all of the distributed colleges, departments, and deans. So there, your big challenge is engagement, because you can't launch anything yourself. You have the expertise in a core center, but all of the power is with the colleges and the units. So you have a huge engagement PR role to play. But it's nice in that you've deduplicated things that might have kind of grown on their own in an ad hoc way in the different colleges and departments. And you can build more centralized expertise. Something like an eCornell, a non-degree granting independent unit, can move very quickly, right? Because they don't have approval processes they have to go through, either through the campus or because they don't offer degrees. They don't have to worry about accreditation. But their market is much smaller potentially because it's only certificates. It's not necessarily for credit. So that can be lucrative. It can return revenue to the campus, but it's not going to change anything about what Cornell faculty do or what the Cornell colleges and departments do. So for many provosts, this just simply isn't enough. This doesn't grapple with the question of online in the core. A degree granting independent unit like Northeastern, again, can move much more quickly, can be much more responsive to market trends. But again, because it's autonomous, it doesn't tend to inflect very much change within the core. So I don't know that, again, that there's a best practice here. The extent to which you can move in any direction depends on lots of legacy traditions at an institution. But I think this is crucial, and this is part of the occasion for this study, of why this is so interesting to provosts now, is the question of, I've got an extension unit, a COE unit, but how do I structure this so that it actually changes my core business model, or so that I can actually get colleges to share resources and best practices? I want to run through early adopters quickly to get a sense of some of the more spectacular failures and then some of the more modern the more modern challenges and obstacles that we face that are less spectacular. So the first two spectacular failures were Fathom and All Learn. And these were major multi-million-dollar investments in online courses, selling individual online courses that I think really didn't have much of a student market. So these were big opportunities and investments, but they didn't really know or test demand prior to launching them. And so it reminds us of the MOOC trend in many ways in that they often started with a very small cadre of very elite Ivy League institutions, weren't getting a lot of buyers, so then explored freemium models, explored corporate partnerships, tried to sell courses to high schools, tried to do more corporate training opportunities, but ended up basically dissolving because revenues never met expenses. By quite an order of magnitude in the case of Columbia here. We spent $15 million in 1 year, but made 700,000. I think we're seeing a similar dilemma play out about MOOCs. A lot of folks are wondering if they will have a business model. A lot of folks, especially the ones who offer them, say it's not that important. We're doing this for the good of humanity. But they will face a similar model in trying to locate a located market for, in many cases, very well done, but individual courses, not degrees, not full enrollment at a university. So I think the first lesson here is to find, again, to look at demand before throwing $25 million at something. The second lesson comes from Illinois Global Campus. So this was launched back in March of 2007. The board announced they would create this new campus, much like the process in Florida. Their initial process or the initial goal was to create a separate unit that would live outside the constituent campuses and partners. So they hope to have 70,000 students by 2018. But the faculty senate just bristled at the notion that they were creating this separate unit that they wouldn't have control over, but they were supposed to ostensibly contribute courses and expertise to. They felt like there would be this giant corporate overreach, all this new revenue, but they would have no say or control over it. So the other big problem was that UI Springfield, which was the only campus within the system that had done anything online. So this is the University of Central Florida of Illinois. Right, Ray Schroeder, who I'm sure you know is one of the kind of gods of online education and higher education, and he didn't want any part of this. He already had his well-running, revenue-generating, lean, mean online operation. He doesn't want to be bogged down by this system-wide initiative. So they didn't get the enrollment numbers they wanted. They spent upwards of $19 million on this, largely on the kind of administrative overhead, building up this new superstructure. And then we're kind of just hoping, waiting for courses and programs to be created for this that didn't come. So they set the revenue enrollment targets first without anticipating what programs they would migrate, what courses they would migrate from which campuses, and talking to faculty about their willingness to do it. The independent org structure rubbed a lot of faculty the wrong way. And then frankly, there wasn't much investment in the capacity among the campuses to do online. They hoped that that would kind of just do itself or start from scratch. So one of the advisors of the faculty at the University of Illinois said, if we had to do this again, we would start with existing successful online courses and programs and try to scale those up, rather than hiring a bunch of vice provosts and administrators first and hoping that the courses would arise out of the ether and deliver these new enrollment numbers and revenues. Now, UC Online has not failed yet, but I did check first. Can I talk about UC Online? But there is some doubt about the extent to which it will succeed, and it has had some troubles. So maybe you all know better than me. These are numbers that were reported in the press, but this began in summer of 2010 with a cyber campus pilot. They expected to get a lot of venture finance, did not get a lot of venture finance, got $750K instead of $6 million. Took out a $7 million loan for the system office, but that's okay because we'll get 7,000 out-of-state, high fee-paying students. They got 11 of those students in spring of 2013. So they're, okay, congratulations. The majority of those from a faculty member in this room. So this has resulted in a lot of discussion in the State House, a lot of input from the governor. We all know about, I guess, Darrell Steinberg's proposed legislation that has since been made a little bit more reasonable. And I think there's now an initiative for $10 million to create a shared common 150 general education courses that could be shared across the campuses. But I think this is another example of the collective action issue, right? Every campus has got its own goals, its own mission, and its own operations. And there are some perceived economies of scale, theoretical gains that could be made from a system perspective. There are lots of challenges, access challenges, throughput challenges, retention challenges within the system. But it's incredibly difficult to engage faculty who have their own jobs at these campuses to contribute to that larger mission. So I think the direction that this is heading, which is toward campus capacity, faculty buy-in, and incentives, is a positive one. Rather than bringing in an external provider, but trying to do the hard, not quick and easy work of building buy-in and getting some of that capacity on the ground on these campuses before we hope to get some of these larger goals off the ground. So this is a quote from Wendy Brown, political science professor, I'm sure many of you know, and I love the quote. It's like, can't we just fold UC Online, sign on to Coursera, and get back to business, right? So there is some discomfort here, the sense that the system is defunding us every year, where the strings are very tight, and we're investing in this big online future when we're cutting classes and increasing face-to-face section sizes. So this is creating a lot of political issues on campus as well. So I would segue from that. Those are, again, larger scale issues that tend to fail or be difficult because of collective action or because of their scale. But I think there's a quieter problem going on with a lot of online strategies. So if we succeed at not making some ill-founded or poorly planned bet, if we start to steer our efforts in the right direction, there are still dozens and dozens of ways to either fail or to not achieve the in the black or the revenue goals, the enrollment goals that you want. So unsustainable vendor contracts. Lots of folks signed up with a company like Deltek or Embanet or BISC, these companies, for-profit companies that will partner with you to create and scale an online program. But they're giving away 60, sometimes 70% of their gross revenue to these companies. And the contracts are written such that there is literally no way to know what they're spending or how well they're doing, or to get out of the contract. Or one university I talked to has to split revenue for 6 more years after nixing the contract because of a teach-out clause. So we're working a lot on this issue about that decision, especially for schools that are just getting into this. Are there parts of this operation I could outsource or should outsource? Am I ever going to be good at marketing and recruiting, or can I pay a company for that? What capacities do I want to build in-house? And how do I make that decision? And then if I do make that decision, what questions do I ask in the contracting process? Because just like with academic libraries, you have librarians who sometimes have no experience negotiating contracts, dealing with companies like Elsevier, who have some experience negotiating contracts. Right? So can we get lawyers or people involved or from the central administration with a finance ear in some of these contract negotiations such that we don't have individual deans getting these very promising marketing pitches about getting 1,000 students in your Master's of Arts in Teaching. Sign here on the dotted line, it'll happen tomorrow. That can be very dangerous. So I won't go into all of them, but there are a lot of ways that people didn't anticipate losing money or hitting a wall where they have. And so what we did was 150 interviews with folks, practitioners who had invested and moved heavily in online scale, and tried to collect all of those mistakes for folks who want to not reinvent the wheel, who want to proactively anticipate those and avoid them to make sure that their strategies are successful. So let me just give you a preview. This is what we call a framing graphic. They're very difficult to explain sometimes, but I think they look cool. But the idea here is to try to give a visualization of how we've organized our best practices studies. So this is how I've organized the categories of investment or of infrastructure that I think are critical for folks like yourselves to consider in terms of an online task force or strategy. And the idea is whether you're grappling with the rise of the multimodal student, so your existing students that are going to increasingly avail themselves of these opportunities, or you're hoping to get new students who currently you're not even getting because you don't offer flexible opportunities. You're going to have to make sure and go down the list in each of these categories to anticipate the infrastructure needs that will be required. So the first one is establishing instructional standards. This one is really about inflecting quality, defining quality, making sure that there's some consensus about what you expect from your online courses. It can alleviate some of the uncertainty that faculty think this is either mailing it in and super easy and asynchronous, or that they're going to have to spend 80 hours a week posting 90 posts a day. This is an opportunity to clarify in a way you never could in a face-to-face setting what you expect from an instructor in an online environment. And also addressing the challenge of getting instructional design expertise and tech help to faculty who might not be aware of it or who might not have the time to, of their own volition, avail themselves of shared services. Incentives are a big issue because some folks early on created very generous incentive packages. Overload pay every time you teach an online course. You're allowed to revise a course every year and get an additional bonus. There are ways to end up really breaking the bank here that are fine when you have 10 or 20 online courses, but when schools get to 500 online courses, 600 online courses, degree programs, they get to this really difficult position where they don't even want to grow online anymore because they can't afford to do it. And the whole reason they did online, in many cases, was to create a more revenue-generating program. So that tends to be a very difficult issue for folks because, frankly, you need the incentives because it takes time and effort for faculty to get involved and create quality courses. But you don't want to create an unsustainable and perpetual entitlement that hamstrings further growth. Program launch. So program launches traditionally tend to be very slow, tend to not be very rigorous, sometimes based on faculty hunches or a few cursory analyses of what other peers are doing. How do we accelerate that process and make it more rigorous, more informed by data, so that we are getting, it's not just if we build it, they will come. We've done some kind of proactive analysis to ensure that there'll be a pipeline of those students when we do launch these programs. Supporting online students is a huge underserved issue, a chronic area of underinvestment, I think, for folks. So whether it's the financial aid, bursar, the registrar, mental health services, career services, the math lab, the writing lab, tutoring, supplementary instruction, there's an assumption that when we add online students or online programs, all of those campus services will say, sure, I'll serve all those new online students, or I'm even aware of those new online students. It never happens. So then you get this dilemma or this decision, this problem of, do I have to hire new folks in the central services? Do I have to upskill them? Do I create new duplicative online service concierge positions? How do we ensure that these students who arguably need those support services more than your face-to-face students because they're not incubated by a campus in the same way, how do we make sure they have access to those in a web-mediated environment? Academic calendar. So it's not just, flexibility isn't just a matter of instructional modality, but a matter of temporal real estate, a matter of the way we use time. So we are kind of tethered to an agrarian calendar in higher education, which was designed around the workforce about 150 years ago, right? But the workforce has changed. We're not as worried about accommodating planting and harvesting. So we have to think about different term formats, different formats within a course, right? Accelerated course formats, multiple summer terms, intersessions, winter terms, multiple start dates. It seems very intuitive. It seems much more reflective of the needs of the market, but it's incredibly difficult to do. Ask your registrar what would be required to do 8 to 10 start dates per year and what that will mean for financial aid, as opposed to, is the registrar in the room? I saw people looking. Okay, yeah. Ask him, yeah. So, a lot of folks have made a lot of missteps there. One school at Georgetown had, I think, 10-week courses in the nursing program, but they had new start dates every 8 weeks. So they had 2 weeks at the end of every term that they had to replace the faculty member or scramble around because they were starting a new course. I mean, these are things that very sophisticated people with experience online are designing and putting in place that are just disasters, and you end up putting a very expensive Band-Aid on them. Risk. Are we getting scared yet about all these investments? Then I'm doing my job. So risk is about, somebody asked a question about intellectual property earlier, state authorization. So we have 50 different sets of rules about getting authorization to offer programs in states other than California, for example. Accessibility. A lot of folks, I think Berkeley actually had a settlement recently about online courses and websites needing to be accessible to folks with a variety of different disabilities. So again, that can be a huge regulatory compliance investment and issue when you're doing online that's different. Fair use is another issue. I showed a video in my face-to-face classroom, nobody said anything about it. What happens when I teach a MOOC and I show a picture online, somebody wants $100,000 for it, or I get sued because I streamed a video that I ripped from a DVD. These are ongoing lawsuits that are still kind of in flux. It's a very abstract legal area, but it's something we have to plan around. And then finally, the question that looms above all of this that I've hinted at already is the build, buy, or partner question. So somebody asked earlier about the transition we're making to tools and implementation resources, not away from best practices, but in addition to. And so that's what we're doing here. So in addition to kind of cataloging all of this into a 4 or 5 hour presentation, what we want to do, because all of those areas, you've got different folks on campuses, different offices that need to change their policies or react to some of the challenges that they'll face, we want to be able to get implementation tools into their hands to diagnose where your current state of practice is. How are we doing across our departments or in our units on this already? Where do we need to go from here? How do we accelerate that implementation, and what are some templates or some ways to fast track that so that we don't have to reinvent it every time? So one of my colleagues is currently finishing an enablement vendor negotiation handbook, and this will be a lengthy implementation guide to diagnosing institutional readiness for outsourcing anything, to understanding what you might and might not be wanting to outsource or build in-house, and then what are all of the considerations in the contracting negotiation to keep in mind. What I'm working on actually right now is what I've called an online curricular prioritization guide. And what this is, time and time again I heard on calls with provosts, oh yeah, we've got 500 online courses, but I don't really know what they are. They were just things that like faculty decided to teach online in the summer. I don't know how many students we have enrolled in them, or whether I'm making money or not, or whether they contribute to a certificate or a degree or a program. That's fairly typical. So what we've tried to do, again, is help folks try to steer more toward program creation, but also to the extent we are migrating individual courses, what are some interesting opportunities that we could steer those individual courses to that would increase student success, or that would bring in new revenues and new enrollments from other kinds of students. So I've got 15 ideas right now, and I'm kind of mapping out diagnostics and implementation guides about how to do them. One is, for example, that accelerated fail-safe course that comes from the University of Alabama, where the students could opt in after dropping or withdrawing from a regular face-to-face course. Another might be a rare languages consortium, for example. This is happening in a lot of elite institutions. Not everybody has faculty who can teach Urdu, but one campus does. Can we create some economies of scale, some shared enrollment across campuses? So again, trying to help folks bring some rationality to the process they have for selecting which courses to migrate, and anticipating what they might get, the strategic ROI from migrating those courses. So I thought I would just highlight 2 of these sections for the sake of all of our sanity, but I will move through them fairly quickly and then hopefully leave some additional time for questions. So I'll start just with a few words about instructional standards. And here, again, it's trying to tackle the quality question. So there are some multi-million-dollar course experiences now that you can check out. The Innovators Accelerator was a course from the Apollo Group, the company that owns the University of Phoenix. This is starring Clayton Christensen and all of the kind of big wigs behind disruptive innovation, mostly aimed at executives. They spent over $1 million creating this course with a design firm. And it has some really cool aspects to it. You get a gamified impact score at the end of the course that measures your engagement and your influence on other people in your project groups and on other people in the course. So you can do very awesome, cool things. I mean, think of Rosetta Stone, right? This is a company that invests millions of dollars in its online course software. MOOCs, people are investing hundreds of thousands of dollars in making them look very smooth, very sexy. And as these things get more public, and where there are already, I think, 3 or 4 rankings websites like Amazon where people can score MOOCs, and the market starts to get very visible. I mean, Rate My Professor's been around for quite some time. So there's some reputational issues here. There's some genuine issues about wanting to make sure our courses are rigorous and live up to our own quality standards. But also the world's a stage now, I think, for online courses. And so we have to consider what we're building into them.
I just want to caution against confusing production values with pedagogical value.
Yeah. Yeah. Right, which is why
you make it glossier, you can spend the money to make it
exactly.
effective. It's not the same thing.
Exactly. Which is why, which is what I was getting at with the genuine student success concerns about, is this a rigorous course? Are students going to succeed in it? Or does the LMS fall apart on day one? Versus how do we look? does this look impressive in the market? Which, again, as you said, does not necessarily translate to the success gains.
Can you just briefly explain what kind of efforts are being made to measure student success? Because I've heard the faculty raise lots of questions, and I really don't know what's out there. So like and one of the things that I've heard the faculty express interest in is not just like how many students complete the course and get a good grade, but do you know if there are any efforts out there to measure success beyond that course? Like, how well do students do in subsequent courses or in their careers?
Yeah. The career one is almost never done. I mean, that's obviously much more difficult to do and to trace back to the section of Calc 101 they took in sophomore year.
Graduate professional degrees, stuff like
well,
that.
I know part of, for example, the San Jose State pilot with Sebastian Thrun and Udacity, they looked at how a student did in their next course, subsequent course, which I think is better. I mean, the first thing you can do is just measure grades, right? Like percentage of A's, percentage of B's. And if the course is really highly quantitative and it's only multiple choice tests and there's less of a gray area, like essay grading or things like that, that can be somewhat rigorous, but it's not very rigorous. So I think there are ways to do it either through some kind of standardized critical thinking or learning test that all of the students have to take. So clearly this course is contributing to the way they're progressing on the CLA or some kind of standardized disciplinary test. And people are trying to create more initiatives to standardize those outcomes in disciplines, but it's very slow going and it's not being applied in many cases. But I think measuring their performance in the next course is probably the best technique I've seen to measure the outcomes aside from the standardized test one.
So if I wanted to learn more about excuse me, how EAB might help me and help the faculty answer those questions, how might I go about doing that? So
you would ask us to send you, so we have, we do have a report called Assessing Student Learning Outcomes. That's a little bit dated now, but has some of the early attempts at doing this, both doing it well and trying to incentivize faculty to do it. So there are some universities that require faculty self-assessment of performance against outcomes in their courses and what they changed in their pedagogy every year as part of their tenure dossier. But I've only found one university that does that. So there are some early examples of faculty actually being assessed on this or being required to report on that, but it tends to be difficult, especially if the outcomes listed are more, I guess, vague or ephemeral or about those long-term career gains. So, I mean, the challenge is that some states might do this for you. Like in Virginia, they created these earnings databases that break down based on what you majored in, where you went to college, and how much you make, which, again, has made a lot of people somewhat upset. But this data is now being made more and more public and can be done to you. So I think it behooves us in higher ed to try to proactively take on some of these challenges and not be purely defensive in our stance with stakeholders that are skeptical about value, because trust us doesn't necessarily always work with trustees and presidents and governors. So it is a contentious area, but very difficult to measure. So the biggest problem we identify with instructional design support that I hinted at earlier, and I think this chart is a great illustration of that, is that most faculty either don't know about it or don't use it. So this was a study where they asked over 5,000 faculty where they go for ideas about instructional design. The overwhelming top answer was myself. The next three areas were scholars I know, scholars at conferences, scholarly society updates. The investments, the central services that we're investing in as provosts, as CFOs, tend to be much lower on the totem pole in terms of utilization. So I spoke to a lot of instructional design, Center for Teaching and Learning folks who said, look, all I can do is set up a table and hand out brochures at the kind of faculty orientation or the intro fair and hope they'll come to us if they have any needs. But by and large, we don't get a lot of uptick or a lot of involvement. So I think Mizzou actually has a great way of solving what's a pretty classic problem. And I think I heard somebody implying that this is somewhat of an issue here. It tends to be an issue at almost all large research universities, is duplication, in some cases internal competition among services and units that provide some of the same instructional design, academic technology services. So People have a Center for Teaching and Learning that tends to be focused on pedagogy, but overwhelmingly face-to-face. Sometimes it's punitive, and not necessarily up-to-date on the latest online course design techniques. You might have a COE or extension unit that's been doing this for years, but frankly, core faculty either don't know about it or wouldn't go to those folks to help them design their courses. And then an IT, academic technology unit, that might not report to the provost, might be the best place for how to use Blackboard or the up-to-date iPads that you might have, but faculty don't want to listen to an IT specialist on how they should teach their course. So what Mizzou did was create one central unit with 30 instructional designers. Now these are folks who either have advanced degrees in this, have some tech course design expertise, but also some teaching experience, maybe a disciplinary specialization that faculty trust. But as we saw with libraries, with grant writing offices, with almost any shared service that you want faculty to utilize, when they're sitting there in a central building, they just don't get used. So what they did was create liaison positions. So one instructional designer specialized in a discipline that would sit and work in an office with the faculty, get to know them, build rapport, build trust, get familiarity with how designing a health sciences or a med school online course is different from a philosophy or an English or a music online course. And they found really almost impossible to meet demand for those instructional designers. And again, that's been almost a perennial tactic in a lot of our studies. So Mizzou does the same thing for grant writing, where they have grant writing specialists embedded in the colleges. Johns Hopkins does this for their med school with librarians. They call them embedded informationists. So it's almost impossible for clinicians and for med students to keep up with the literature all the time, but they have to do these lit reviews and scholarly papers. So the librarians are experts at that, and they can help and accelerate that process in a way that they just didn't think about before they were embedded. I guess I'll just wrap up with one more example, which comes from Virginia Tech. The provost at Virginia Tech credits almost all of the cultural acclamation and buy-in for online on their campus to this Faculty Development Institute that's run out of their IT shop. So every new faculty member in the pipeline has to go through this orientation where they are familiarized through these short accelerated modules with the IT tech support and the academic online course design services, such that after a decade of doing this, almost 100% of their faculty have been through these sessions, and they have absolutely no resistance now on campus to tech-enhanced or web-enabled teaching. So this is, we sometimes call these contiguous practices in that there are kind of layers of maturity or levels of complexity and sophistication as you go up. You can't build this overnight. But I think what's smart about this is focusing on the pipeline of new faculty. Because one of the downsides of PhD programs often are that there aren't a lot of teaching courses involved in a PhD program. So sometimes you're hiring new faculty who are great researchers but haven't created some concept of how they've always taught, right? They're still fairly new to teaching. They're still fairly open to new suggestions. And by controlling this pipeline, you avoid a perpetual fight with the old guard or with people who are never going to change the way they teach or teach an online or hybrid course. And over time, over 5 or 10 years of doing this, this just becomes part of the expectation or part of the culture. So I think this is a great way to sidestep some of the most difficult aspects of faculty engagement and get a lot of buy-in and expertise early on. So I will send everybody a copy of the full report. So when you're up at night and you can't sleep, I don't know this would help you sleep, but it can give you a sense of the depth we have and where you might want to follow up. So at the end of each section, I've got a slide like this that tries to chart out the contiguous practice or the layers of maturity and sophistication that we think folks are going to have to get through. So in the case of instructional design standards, the first step is really setting clear guidelines and expectations. I think a lot of us don't really have that yet, or any kind of clear communication with faculty about the impact on workload or how many times they're expected to post in a forum. I think the next step is making sure you've got sufficient instructional design support that have the skills. These folks can demand pretty high salaries and are very difficult for a lot of more access-focused schools to hire. So it's important to have that support and then to make sure you've done something to up or increase utilization of those folks. And then finally, I think the most advanced stage is trying to build this into your incentive systems or into your tenure and promotion processes. We're laughing already, but to try to ingrain it more in the culture of what's expected at the university, as online becomes less of this kind of auxiliary or exotic practice and more part of just what's expected or part of what we think about when we think about good quality pedagogy. Just being part of that conversation, not something inherently different. But again, I think that there's a reason we put that to the far right on the slide, because I think that's much easier said than done. So I've covered as much as I could in the time that I have, but yeah, would love to take any questions about anything I covered or stuff that I didn't have a chance to get to.
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate Phyllis and Cynthia and Diana bringing this together, because I have never heard of EAB before and didn't realize that these resources were available, and this is fantastic. I mean, it's very helpful. It's very validating, you know, for many of the questions that we've been asking. Just what you presented online, the law school's gone through this whole trajectory and thought process, and to see a lot of the statements that you have are actual statements that we have in some of our documents about what we think would be a high quality course, for example, or what, you know, evaluating student outcomes. And it's just, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy you're going to share, that you're willing to share this presentation,
Oh,
because I'd really like to share it with the entire online education team. And
Great. That's it. That was an excellent question. And I did not plant you in the...
Yeah. So I have a quick question. I thought one of the most fascinating things that you touched on was that the audiences are coming kind of from regional. They're not really the far-flung audiences that you would expect. I think this is one of the things we're learning. And I think, you know, I read proposals for new online degree programs, and I think what I'm noticing is that there's this idea that the Berkeley brand is going to be world renowned, and that we're going to get these audiences, you know, world audiences. And I think we're learning some hard lessons about the limits of the Berkeley brand. And but I think it's very hard to have a conversation with a person who's very excited about the potential for a new degree program. What really is the market for this program? What is a true feasibility study? How do you understand audiences? And also, since ours are professional, many of our programs are professional degree oriented. What are the limits of adult? What is the capacity of the adult audience? And some of these very hard lessons. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about marketing analysis and feasibility, and understanding these potential, where these potential audiences reside and how you reach them.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Bringing rigor to program launch is the section of this that addresses that. But briefly, you know, even just requiring a feasibility study that is a real feasibility study and not just like, what would you say about feasibility, or what is your hunch, is or is it like, oh yeah, I think it's feasible. Okay, check. Even that is somewhat rare in higher education, especially in the core. Outside of an extension unit that is more business savvy, I guess, or has closer ties with employers. So that is tremendously difficult, and a lot of folks do learn the hard way. So I mean, there are lots of things I could say about that. It's part of the core competency of our folks in the continuing and online education space. But there are lots of best practices there. I mean, focus groups are classically bad, because would you like to potentially enroll in a program like this? It just, that inflates the numbers more than you could imagine. You know, have you demonstrably reimbursed tuition for programs like this as an employer, right? So programs where they got a lot of expressed interest among alumni, among current students, but the students weren't willing to defer 2 years of salary for a given program, and our employers weren't willing to send their employees to the program, so they got 2 students in a gerontology master's program. So that's a big part of what we're doing through our partnership with Burning Glass, to try to get beyond hunches and Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which is kind of, it's kind of vague and it's dated. It's 2 or 3 years behind. So we are trying to help folks understand both micro trends that they could analyze. What are the top 25 most important skills and job listings in the Bay Area? Or what are areas that we have programs where we could help fill a niche where there are new skills emerging within an existing professional degree we have? It might be that, like cyber infrastructure, there's an area of that that nobody is serving currently within IT professionals and master's programs. But we have to find ways at getting that knowledge. We can also leverage faculty connections with employers. We can have an advisory board, a separate governance process that oversees this, because the governance considerations that go into launching a PhD program and the market considerations are very different from a professional master's degree, which might be kind of launched out of that program with many of the same faculty. But often we have the same committees that oversee both of those processes. So there are lots of ways, and I'd be happy to follow up later about best practices we have about being more rigorous there and being able to fast launch things more quickly, such that if we do identify cyber infrastructure, it's not 7 years from the time we identified that to graduating students, which often it is, right? If we have a 3-year approver cycle and it takes students 4 years to get through.
So we want to bring this formal part to a conclusion. Diana's going to say a couple of words about the Berkeley Resource Center for Online Education, and then please don't leave because we want to have a couple of minutes for you to fill out your evaluation.
All right, well, thank you.
The Berkeley Resource Center for Online Education, you can understand how excited we are to be a member of Education Advisory Board, because it just opens up a world of data and information and resources that we can tap into for the campus, for those of you who are interested, particularly in online education. So Berkeley Resource Center for Online Education, you touched on so many things that we want to be able to support our campus with, and that's really kind of a full service start at the very beginning, just when you have that plant or seed of a thought that you're interested potentially in something online, whether it's a MOOC or a hybrid or a course or a degree program or a certificate program. Please talk to us, because we will reach out, to the experts, and we'll reach out to those of you across the campus, the library, the registrar's office. We're trying to do a bit of coordination so that we can collect all this information. Audit and Advisory Service is actually putting together a report for us that will be shared and that we'll all be able to tap into. I can't emphasize enough the importance of the planning and the thought that goes into anything right before you launch. But we talked several times, it came up about market research studies. So that's something that actually comes, believe it or not, a little bit later on in the process, because first we have to start even earlier with the idea. By the time you get to the study, it's actually fairly specific on what it is you want to do the feasibility study on, and that's something that we can help you with, and we're getting better at. Those of you who are interested, because we've been hearing a lot about your interest, we talked about regional reach versus international reach. I can speak fairly confidently, but you guys may know more, Colin and Laura. There are not a lot of vendors out there who know how to do market research on the international market. Would you agree with that? So we're all learning together, because, imagine doing a market study encompassing students from around the world. So we are learning. I noticed Knapp was here earlier, School of Public Health, Integrated Circuits. It's actually helpful because School of Public Health, they're getting so many inquiries from international students. They decided not to open it up to the world immediately, but they're actually focusing on specific countries, and we're targeting specific countries for recruitment and marketing, which is a strategy that's actually working very well. So with that in mind, please, those of you who know me, diana.wu@berkeley.edu. Our Director of Marketing is here. Berkeley Resource Center for Online Education. We are here to support your online initiative. So thank you for that 90-second plug, and I'm going to let Cynthia close. Colin and Laura so much for coming out from DC and helping us understand as a campus the rich resources that are available through the Education Advisory Board and giving us an in-depth look at one of your topics. We are constantly evaluating our investment in the service. If you fill out this lovely green form, which if you don't have, it's on the table, maybe Noemi, you can pass out some of these. This will help us. And also under number 5, for those of you who are at the services overview presentation, which was the first session today, I think it would be really helpful if you use the any additional comment section to tell us how you envision you would be using the EAB services. I think that'll help us understand where people see the value here and how we can help facilitate that. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to come here and learn about EAB. And thanks, Colin.